In the deepest corners of the internet, the parts search engines can't reach, the parts you need special software just to access. There's a specific kind of website that shows up again and again in true crime forums, cybersecurity research papers, and FBI case files. Hitman for hire sites. Most people assume they're obviously fake. A scam. Nobody could actually be dumb enough to believe you can order a murder online like it's a pizza delivery. Except thousands of people did believe it. Real people with real money, and in at least one documented case, a real and devastating outcome. This is the story of one of the most infamous sites of its kind. A site that ran for years, took in what's estimated to be well over $1 million from desperate, angry, and sometimes genuinely dangerous people, and the strange, twisted truth about what was actually happening behind the scenes. By the end of this, you're going to understand why cybersecurity researchers still argue about whether this website did more good or more harm in the world. Let's get into it. To understand this story, you need a quick primer on how the dark web actually works, because it's not what most people picture from movies. The dark web isn't some separate internet floating out in cyberspace. It's a set of websites hosted using special anonymizing software, most commonly something called Tor, short for the onion router, that bounces your connection through multiple layers of encrypted relays scattered across the globe, making it extremely difficult to trace who's hosting a site or who's visiting it. It was originally developed, ironically, with U.S. government funding, intended for things like protecting journalists and dissidents living under oppressive regimes. But like most powerful tools, it didn't take long for people to start using it for exactly the opposite purpose. By the early 2010s, the dark web had become infamous for hosting marketplaces selling drugs, stolen data, counterfeit documents, and worse. The most famous of these was Silk Road, a black market bazaar that got shut down by the FBI in 2013 after its creator was arrested and eventually sentenced to life in prison. But in the shadow of marketplaces like Silk Road, a much darker and much stranger category of websites started popping up. Murder for hire sites. The concept was simple, at least on the surface. You'd visit the site through Tor, browse a slick, professional-looking interface, often disturbingly well-designed, with FAQs, pricing tiers, and customer testimonials, and submit a request. You'd provide a target's name, photo, address, daily routine, whatever information you had. You'd select a package, ranging from a simple beating to a more severe injury, all the way up to a killing. Prices varied by site, but they'd typically range from a few $1,000s for an assault, up into the tens of thousands for a homicide, payable exclusively in Bitcoin to preserve anonymity. The most notorious of these sites operated under a name referencing an old Albanian secret society tied to codes of loyalty and revenge, invoking imagery of a shadowy criminal network with operatives scattered across the world, standing by, ready to carry out whatever twisted request came through the site's order form. And for years, thousands of people believed it was completely real. Here's where the story gets genuinely disturbing, because regardless of whether the site's operators had any actual intention or capability of carrying out real violence, the people submitting these requests absolutely believed they were ordering real harm against real human beings. Cybersecurity researchers and journalists who later gained access to leaked internal databases from these sites found thousands of submitted orders. Names, photos, home addresses, detailed daily schedules of intended victims. Some orders came from people who appeared to be in the middle of ugly divorces, wanting a spouse eliminated before a custody battle could finish. Some came from people describing business rivals they wanted gone. Some, disturbingly, came from people describing family members, parents targeting their own children, children targeting parents, siblings targeting siblings, over inheritance disputes and long-simmering resentments that had apparently boiled over into a willingness to pay strangers on the internet to make someone disappear. One particular order, later covered extensively in journalistic investigations, came from an individual requesting harm against an ex-partner. The requester provided extremely specific, detailed information: home address, vehicle description, daily commute pattern, even the specific times the target would be alone. This wasn't someone venting anger in a chat room. This was someone who had clearly spent real time surveilling another human being, compiling a dossier detailed enough that, in the hands of an actual violent person, could genuinely have gotten someone killed. That's the part that makes this story so uncomfortable. It doesn't really matter, from a moral standpoint, whether the site itself was capable of following through. The people submitting these orders believed they were paying for a real killing. Their intent was real, even if the outcome, in most documented cases, wasn't what they expected. Because here's the twist that took years for the full picture to come into focus. Extensive investigative work, some done by journalists, some by independent cybersecurity researchers who spent months infiltrating these communities under fake identities, eventually revealed that at least one of the most infamous of these sites wasn't actually a murder-for-hire operation at all. It was a scam. A very elaborate, very profitable scam, specifically preying on people who were already willing to commit an actual crime. Think about the genius of it from a purely cynical, criminal-minded perspective. If you're running a fake hitman site, who exactly is your victim going to complain to when they realize they've been scammed? They can't go to the police. They just paid thousands of dollars in Bitcoin to have someone murdered. The moment they open their mouth about being ripped off, they're confessing to attempted murder for hire. It's arguably one of the only criminal enterprises where the victims of the fraud are structurally incapable of ever reporting it. According to research published by journalists who dug deep into leaked chat logs and site back-end data, the operation worked something like this. Customers would place an order and pay a deposit. The site's operators, who researchers now believe were likely a small handful of individuals, possibly based in Eastern Europe, rather than any kind of organized secret society, would then string the customer along for weeks or months. They'd send updates. They'd claim surveillance was underway. They'd occasionally request additional payment for complications. The target moved. The target got a new security system. The job required additional manpower. Classic scam escalation tactics, just applied to the most disturbing possible service imaginable. Eventually, the hit would either be reported as completed, using a real local news story about an unrelated death or disappearance in the target's area as fake proof, or the operators would simply go silent and stop responding altogether once they judged they'd extracted as much money as they could. Nobody died. Not because anyone showed mercy, but because, according to the most thorough available research, there was never a hitman on the other end of that website to begin with. That should be the end of the story. A cynical but almost darkly comedic scam preying on the worst impulses of desperate, angry people. Except it's not the end of the story. Because that's where the part that made this website infamous, genuinely infamous, not just as an internet oddity but as a documented tragedy, comes in. In 2016, law enforcement in the United Kingdom investigated a case where a young woman had been receiving threats and eventually died under violent, suspicious circumstances. During the investigation, it came to light that a request targeting her had, in fact, been submitted to one of these dark web hitman-for-hire sites, the very kind of site that researchers believe to be a scam operation with no actual capacity for violence. The individual who had submitted that order was someone already known to the victim. This is where the story stops being a strange internet oddity and becomes something genuinely tragic, and it's important to be careful and precise here, because the facts of this specific case are complicated and were the subject of extensive legal proceedings. What investigators determined was that the site itself almost certainly never carried out the order. There was no evidence of any hired operative, no network of assassins, nothing resembling the organized criminal enterprise the site's branding implied. But the person who submitted the request had clearly intended for harm to come to the victim, had taken active steps to try to arrange it, and tragically, that same individual was later connected to the actual violence the victim suffered, carried out not by any hired third party, but by the person who'd placed the original order themselves. In other words, the fake hitman site didn't do it. But the fact that someone was willing to pay for it, was willing to go through the process of researching a dark web marketplace, learning how to acquire Bitcoin, compiling surveillance information on another human being, and submitting a detailed request for violence, turned out to be a chilling, documented warning sign of intent that, in this specific and heartbreaking case, was followed through on by other means. This case, more than any other, is why researchers and journalists who study this topic take these sites far more seriously than most people assume. The debate among cybersecurity researchers isn't really about whether these specific websites had actual hired killers on staff. The overwhelming body of evidence suggests they didn't, that it was scam infrastructure preying on desperate and dangerous people for profit. The real, ongoing debate is about what to do with the data these sites generate. Should the thousands of leaked order requests, real names, real addresses, real detailed plans submitted by real people expressing genuine intent to harm someone, be treated as actionable evidence? Should law enforcement be proactively investigating people who submitted these orders, even in cases where no violence has occurred yet, given that intent to commit serious harm was clearly documented? Some researchers who've worked directly with leaked databases from these sites say they've cross-referenced names and details against public records and found unsettling matches. Missing persons cases, unsolved disappearances, domestic violence reports, that at minimum suggest some of these submitted orders may not have been idle fantasy. That's where I'm going to leave this one for now. In part 2, we're going deeper into the specific site's takedown, the researchers who spent months undercover trying to unmask the people actually running it, and the unsettling question that still doesn't have a clean answer. How many of the names in those leaked databases belong to people who eventually found another way to get what they paid for? Websites almost certainly never had a single real assassin working for it. It was a scam, a brutally clever one, built specifically to exploit people who were already willing to pay for murder, knowing full well those victims could never go to the police. But we also learned that at least one of those orders was connected to a real tragedy, a real death, not carried out by any hired operative, but by the very person who placed the order in the first place. Tonight, we're going deeper into how researchers finally tracked down who was actually running these sites, into the sheer scale of what was found when the databases leaked, and into a question that still doesn't have a clean, comfortable answer. If you haven't seen part 1, go back and watch it first. This one's going to hit different if you know how we got here. If you're caught up, let's keep going. Technical researchers who dug into the site's Bitcoin wallet addresses, a surprisingly common way to unravel dark web operations, since blockchain transactions are permanently recorded and, with the right tools, traceable in ways many criminals don't fully appreciate, found that money flowing into these hitman site wallets often got funneled into the same handful of destination wallets used by other, seemingly unrelated dark web scam operations. Fake drug marketplaces, fake weapon sales, fake hacking for hire services. It increasingly looked less like a dedicated murder-for-hire enterprise and more like one node in a broader web of scam sites, all run by opportunists who'd realized that dark web users, people already primed to believe in an underground economy of illegal services, made for remarkably easy marks. That's an uncomfortable irony worth sitting with for a second. The same secrecy and anonymity that these sites' actual customers were relying on to protect themselves from law enforcement was the exact same feature that made it impossible for them to ever get their money back, or hold anyone accountable, once they realized they'd been conned. The real turning point in this story came when one of these operations suffered what researchers believe was either an internal security failure or a deliberate leak, possibly from a disgruntled member of the group running the site, though this has never been conclusively confirmed. A substantial cache of internal data made its way into the hands of journalists and researchers. What was inside that data was staggering. Thousands of submitted order forms, real names of intended targets, home addresses, photographs, some clearly pulled from the target's own social media accounts, others looking like they'd been taken covertly, without the target's knowledge, suggesting actual physical surveillance had taken place before the order was even submitted. Detailed notes on daily routines, what time someone left for work, what gym they attended, what car they drove, which nights they were reliably alone. Researchers who reviewed this data described it as one of the most disturbing datasets they'd ever worked with, specifically because of what it represented, regardless of whether any of these orders had actually been fulfilled in the way the customers believed. Every single entry in that database represented a real person who had gone through an elaborate, deliberate process, researching how to access the dark web, learning how to acquire and use cryptocurrency, compiling detailed information on another human being, and submitting a formal request for that person to be harmed or killed. That's not idle rage. That's not someone venting in a group chat about how much they hate their ex. That is premeditation, documented in writing, submitted with payment attached. Some names in that database, when cross-referenced against public court records and news archives by researchers, matched up with real domestic violence cases. Real restraining orders filed around the same time period. In a small number of instances, names matched up with people who were later convicted of unrelated violent crimes against the very person named as the target in their dark web order, suggesting that when the scam site failed to deliver, at least some of these individuals simply found another way to act on their intent. This is the detail that transforms this story from a strange internet curiosity into something genuinely important from a public safety standpoint. The debate that emerged among researchers and even some law enforcement officials wasn't really about the scam sites themselves anymore. It became about what responsibility exists legally, ethically, practically once this kind of data exists. If you have a database containing thousands of real names of people expressing documented intent to seriously harm or kill another specific, named individual, what do you do with that information? Who does it get reported to? Does a private citizen or independent journalist who obtains this data through their own investigative work have an obligation to alert law enforcement, even in cases where no crime has yet occurred against the named target? And practically speaking, would any police department even have the resources to investigate thousands of leads originating from an anonymous dark web leak, most of which might amount to nothing more than a very dark, very disturbing venting exercise that was never going to go anywhere? There's no clean answer to any of that. Different researchers who've worked with this kind of data have made different choices. Some have quietly passed specific, credible-seeming threats along to law enforcement contacts when names could be matched to real, identifiable people and real, ongoing risk. Others have chosen. Perhaps the most unsettling angle of this entire story is the people who appear in these leaked databases as targets. People who, in many documented cases, had absolutely no idea any of this had ever happened. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere out there, right now, there are almost certainly people going about their normal lives, going to work, picking up their kids, living completely unaware, whose name, photo, home address, and daily schedule sat inside a dark web database for years, attached to a formal request that someone once paid real money hoping would result in their death. In a handful of cases that have been reported on by journalists who did manage to identify and contact people found in these leaked databases, the reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Shock, disbelief, and in some cases, a chilling moment of clarity about a relationship or situation in their life that had felt off for reasons they'd never been able to fully articulate. One individual, contacted by a researcher after being identified in one of these leaks, reportedly recalled a period of time years earlier when they'd felt an unshakable sense of being watched. Strange cars parked near their home for extended periods, a feeling of being followed that they'd eventually written off as paranoia. After learning they'd been the named target of a dark web murder-for-hire order during roughly that same window of time, that feeling took on a very different meaning. To be clear, this doesn't mean actual physical surveillance definitely happened in every case, or that every uneasy feeling someone's ever had in their life is retroactively explained by these leaks. But it does mean that for at least some people, information that felt like an unsolvable, nagging unease turned out to have a very concrete, very disturbing explanation sitting quietly in a database they never knew existed. Perhaps the most unsettling angle of this entire story is the people who appear in these leaked databases as targets. People who, in many documented cases, had absolutely no idea any of this had ever happened. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere out there, right now, there are almost certainly people going about their normal lives, going to work, picking up their kids, living completely unaware, whose name, photo, home address, and daily schedule sat inside a dark web database for years, attached to a formal request that someone once paid real money hoping would result in their death. In a handful of cases that have been reported on by journalists who did manage to identify and contact people found in these leaked databases, the reactions were exactly what you'd expect. Shock, disbelief, and in some cases, a chilling moment of clarity about a relationship or situation in their life that had felt off for reasons they'd never been able to fully articulate. One individual, contacted by a researcher after being identified in one of these leaks, reportedly recalled a period of time years earlier when they'd felt an unshakable sense of being watched. Strange cars parked near their home for extended periods, a feeling of being followed that they'd eventually written off as paranoia. After learning they'd been the named target of a dark web murder-for-hire order during roughly that same window of time, that feeling took on a very different meaning. To be clear, this doesn't mean actual physical surveillance definitely happened in every case, or that every uneasy feeling someone's ever had in their life is retroactively explained by these leaks. But it does mean that for at least some people, information that felt like an unsolvable, nagging unease turned out to have a very concrete, very disturbing explanation sitting quietly in a database they never knew existed. As of the most recent research and reporting on this topic, several versions of these dark web hitman-for-hire sites have been taken down over the years, either by law enforcement action, by hosting providers pulling the plug once media attention became too intense, or by the operators themselves shutting things down and disappearing once they'd extracted what they judged to be enough money from their marks. But here's the uncomfortable truth that researchers who study this space consistently point out. The model hasn't gone away. simply evolved. New versions of these sites continue to appear, using updated branding, better designed interfaces, and increasingly sophisticated tactics to avoid the mistakes that led to previous operators getting unmasked. As cryptocurrency privacy tools have improved and as dark web infrastructure has matured, tracing the money trail has, in some ways, gotten harder rather than easier for outside researchers trying to repeat the kind of investigative work that cracked open earlier versions of these sites. And the fundamental, ugly truth at the core of all of it hasn't changed one bit. There is still, apparently, a consistent and steady demand from real people willing to pay real money hoping to have another real human being killed. Whether or not any given site is actually capable of delivering on that promise almost feels secondary to the fact that the demand itself never seems to dry up. Cybersecurity researchers who track this corner of the dark web describe it less as a single ongoing mystery and more as a permanent, grim feature of the internet's underbelly. One that occasionally produces genuine tragedy, mostly produces elaborate financial fraud, and consistently produces a kind of unsettling data trail that reveals, in the most uncomfortable way possible, just how many people out there are willing to go to disturbing lengths against someone else in their life. If there's one thing worth taking away from this story, it's this. The internet has an almost unlimited capacity to make the darkest, most extreme human impulses feel accessible, anonymous, and consequence-free. Most of the time, as we've seen here, that accessibility is itself a lie. A scam built specifically to exploit people already standing at the edge of something terrible. But the intent behind those orders was real. And in at least one documented, heartbreaking case, so was the outcome. If you or someone you know is in an unsafe relationship or situation, please don't wait for something like this to be the reason you reach out for help. There are people and resources ready to help before things escalate. If this story stuck with you, let me know in the comments and hit subscribe, because next week, we're covering another mystery from the darkest corners of the internet that most people have never heard of. Stay safe out there.